brand new show of Market Makers. Well, even though financial markets or history of financial markets has exhibited that elections they come and go, markets it is always a short-term sentiment adjustment which is always at play. The long-term picture for equity markets and valuations is always a function of underlying growth and underlying earnings. But for next 45 to 50 days, all the market narrative, conversation, dealing room assumptions would be centered around politics. So what exactly are markets pricing in from this election cycle? Not what the verdict would be, what is important is what exactly markets are pricing in. So to discuss that, my guest today is someone, he tracks markets but he also tracks politics with a magnifying glass. So it's a rare combination to have a businessman or a fund manager who is also tracking politics very closely. Nilesh, fantastic to have you back and thank you for joining us. I normally start with the view on the markets, but we have to start with the view on politics. What's your sense?
Always a pleasure, Nikunj, to be here. Clearly what I think the markets are looking forward to is continuity. That basically the
muscle memory cannot force us to start with politics, right? We have to start with markets only.
Markets are basically pricing in or factoring in that basically you're going to see Modi 2.0, that the incumbent government will get voted back. Obviously, the extent of the verdict is still, it's very hard to predict or forecast, but clearly I think what the markets are pricing in that basically you will see this government getting re-elected and getting a second term. This is what, and I don't think the markets are really at this point of time prepared for any kind of an adverse outcome or an outcome which is against this view right now. And I don't think the market is prepared for any kind of uncertainty. So right now, I think clearly the markets are predicting that the government will get a second term, and I don't think the markets are factoring in any kind of uncertainty or an adverse outcome.
Okay, so let's look at three scenarios. Possibly these are the three scenarios which which logical scenarios which we can think of. Return of current administration, it's current avatar. Return of the current administration with an outside support or change of administration. What happens in scenario A, B and C to the market? How will they react? How will stocks move? How will the Nifty move?
Well, scenario A is where the current government basically gets a majority on its own, the pre-poll NDA. Clearly, I think the markets will actually greet that, cheer that, and you might actually see some bit of upward momentum to the Nifty. Maybe another 5 to 10% move from the current levels.
So a clear majority, more upside.
More upside. I think if it's basically the NDA with outside support or the non-pre-NDA partners also coming in on board, I think the markets will be pretty fine with that. And obviously, of course, within that, one will have to basically see which are those political parties which basically lend outside support. So I think markets will be more neutral to that kind of scenario. You could probably go to maybe another 3-4% up move, that kind of stuff. If it is not the current government, then of course there are different range of scenarios open up. Is it going to be a Congress-led government, or is it going to be a third front with outside support of the Congress or outside support of the BJP? I mean, that's obviously, of course, I probably think that's going to be a doomsday scenario where the markets initially will take it like a shock, that you could actually have a pretty much like what happened in 2004 when basically the Bajpayee government did not get re-elected and the markets fell by almost about close to 10%. So that if that third scenario plays out, then of course the markets will essentially respond to that with some kind of a shock.
Okay. Will you be a buyer if markets fall 5-10% irrespective of the mandate?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think if the markets were to fall 10%,
irrespective of the mandate.
Irrespective of the mandate. And that's because I think one will have to kind of go back into history and see that right from 91 onwards, right up to 2014, we always had coalition governments. And I think in that period, India saw a growth of about 7%, irrespective. I think if you look at last 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 25 years, the GDP CAGR has been around 7%, give or take 25 or 50 basis points here or there, but it has been around 7% CAGR. So I don't see growth getting impacted, number one. Number two is, of course, what you could see basically is the government's loading up on the fiscal side, in the sense that obviously then you might see a lot of populist measures going ahead further, which in turn will create some bit of challenging scenario for the economy, but then India challenging periods. And I think that's the way I would look at it from a positive point of view. So if the markets were to correct 5-10% because of an adverse or a non-consensus verdict, my sense is that would be a good time to load up on Indian equities.
We'll pull up that data, and we've looked at some data which tells you that 8 out of 10 times in an election year markets have gone up, and we've looked at binary event. Second, flows. We looked at some data again, Nilesh, and this is again data which is available in on the various websites. We've looked at data of FI flows from 1992, and there have been only 3 instances where foreign institutions 15-18 years, and that had nothing to do with election. So do you think we are just trying to just get into some kind of an scary mental build up looking at the election result? Because history tells us that markets rarely go up after the election verdict irrespective of the mandate, and foreign institutional investors have not sold or they've not panicked irrespective of the nature of the government.
Yeah, absolutely, because I think clearly if you really look at economic policies of India over the last, ever since economic reforms have been unveiled in 1991 onwards, by and large, both the national parties have remained basically committed to economic reforms. It's just the kind of nature of economic reforms which get priority during the tenure of a specific government. Even during a third front government, okay, it really has been very important who's the finance minister. Okay, and I think if we roll back to the 90s, we had the dream budget unveiled during the third front government.
We tend to forget that.
So, that I think FDI in a lot of sectors got opened up actually during that period between 97 to 2000 or 96 to maybe 98 period. So I clearly believe that I think economic reforms is the way forward irrespective of which government is in power. It's just the kind of posturing which that government adopts. So clearly if there is a sell-off, if there is a knee-jerk reaction, I think of course very good chance that foreign investors will continue to load up on India because of the strong structural long-term growth story of India. But I think that would be a fantastic time even for domestic investors to really step in and not really get unnerved or distracted by basically the noise of the election verdict.
Now, foreign institutional investors have a different pool of money, and some would argue that they have an unlimited source of capital because of global allocation. Domestic investors, they have limited capital. And especially private investors, they have only 2 options: remain fully invested or sit on cash. If your view is that markets can fall after the election if there is a change of guard, then how should one approach their portfolios in the run up to the election? Have 10% cash, 15% cash, or have no cash whatsoever?
So the way to really look at it is that if we look at FPIs or foreign portfolio investors, they could have a different kind of capital, a more long-term kind of capital. But look at it, they have many options. So for some reason, if India falls out of favor with them, they can probably go to other emerging market, or they can go back to a developed market, they can go back to their home market, okay. Whereas for domestic investors, this is the place. India is probably the only option that you have. And within that, you have equities where you actually need to take a long-term view, So I actually believe that if there were to be basically a knee-jerk reaction, I think that would be a fantastic time for domestic investors to look at this basically as an opportunity to go ahead and invest.
But you need to have cash in your portfolio in order to buy when markets fall.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Which means should one keep 8 to 10% cash in their portfolio? If this market falls, you get opportunity.
It might be a good idea.
It might do that in your portfolio.
We in fact have, we have some bit of cash as well. So it might just be a good idea to kind of, and especially because the markets have kind of inched up. I wouldn't say moved up or accelerated, but markets have inched up. Valuations, especially in the large cap space, are not necessarily compelling. If at all, we are at the top end of the valuation kind of range. So you should always keep some dry powder, probably because of the election verdict or because of any other event which could essentially kind of bring back some kind of normalization of valuation, and maybe that's a good time to step in. So election or no election, I think ideally it makes sense for investors to have some cash so that you could deploy it when Mr. Market offers you that opportunity.
Now, you said that markets could go higher if the current government comes back in the current avatar, or even with a smaller outside support. Some would argue that what has changed in the last 5 years? 2014, there was a promise that earnings would recover. There was a promise that India would accelerate. There was a promise that we will see a widespread job creation. The last 5 years have been good for the world. Global growth has been there. Thankfully, we've not had any global crisis. We've not had any large terrorist attack. And yet earnings are disappointing us. So even if the current government comes back, what will change from a market standpoint? More of the same?
And in terms of job creation or whatever it is, the reality is that in the last 5 years, India has remained amongst the world's fastest growing economies, or maybe the fastest growing large economy. That's essentially fact number one. Fact number two is essentially is that what will drive or sustain this growth even in the future is a lot of the steps and reforms which were undertaken in the last 5 years. So why did probably there was some sluggishness in economic activities? Because a lot of landmark or defining reforms were unveiled. Be it RERA, IBC, GST, a whole bunch of these kind of initiatives. Now, clearly, with economic reforms, the positivity of those reforms only are felt with some kind of lag. When economic reforms were unveiled in 91, probably for the first 2-3 years, they were not really, the impact was not seen. The impact was seen maybe a few years later. Okay, whatever the Vajpayee government did was probably not felt as much during that term, but essentially it laid the foundation for a stellar growth for India for the next 5-10 years. So I think whatever this government has done essentially will be seen over the next 5 years.
So then does not matter who the next Prime Minister is.
Basically, this government to win the second term is because I think it's a huge sign of stability. It's a huge sign of continuity that basically political risk is not there. So like when we were earlier alluding to global investors, foreign investors, for them political risk becomes an important
that premium
aspect.
Is justified.
Absolutely. So the thing is, there is no political risk. Now it's back to growth and back to earnings. And I think the third most important thing which could play out in the next 5 years is basically interest rates. I think with inflation where it is, we need significantly lower interest rates. And I think higher interest rates is essentially one thing which has been blunting India's competitiveness in the global arena. And I think there'll be a huge positive for economic growth, earnings growth, and especially for sectors like infrastructure and real estate and all those kind of sectors.
Setting up to do. So that's why we are slowly moving forward.
I just do want you to just acknowledge and react to one allegation on you, which is basically that there is an allegation that you have you evaded huge amounts of tax and siphoned off hundreds of crores to foreign countries to purchase properties in the name of your employees.
No, this is all rubbish news, because this was a rumor news. I also read when you are successful, people put these things and all, but it's no truth in this at all.
So there is no
Not
documentation
at all, not at all.
been.
We had a raid and everything, and they have whatever their things they have taken. They also have something in their mind. It is there is a tax evasion. We have done this, we have done that, but now they have seen everything. They have seen all the transactions and everything. Now they are pretty much. See, today it's not I'm selling something and taking cash out of it.
That's true.
Everything is legitimate with all these big international players. They just do one-to-one business. They send every money by RTGS. So
You have learned that you have ensured that you do not carry on.
see, obviously I can't say what my father mistake was there, but one thing which I have taken from him is the passion for music, without which running a music label it's impossible.
But tell me something, you never had any dream of any other profession as a child?
No, I didn't have a dream of becoming a businessman also, neither to take over my father's business. I've never thought about that. At that time, nothing, I thought, what I'll do. Means it was just a blank thing when I took over the business. And my father, means one thing which I have changed from my father, it's not his mistake, but he used to trust people, means like anything, means he used to trust so many people. But because I'm taking care of his business, I never say, okay, it's my business, his business I'm taking care of. So I don't trust everybody so quickly. So that's the thing which is not his mistake, but he was the owner, he could have done anything, but I have to take my step thinking 10 times whether I'm taking correct step or not. But he was not like that. He could he used to take
Blind trust.
कि ये ऐसे कर दो, and he never used to sit on the P&L. Everything used to come like profits used to come. Today I have to sit, if I'm making this movie, it will be this cost and this recovery and all. He never used to do that.
Okay.
In terms of music and all, he just go on his conviction, and his conviction worked every time.
Okay, fair enough. Well, on that note, I wish you all the very best, Bhushan.
Thank you very much.
It's been a tremendous inning so far, and all the very best for all your new endeavors going forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.